Thank you. I'll start by doing an acknowledgement of the traditional custodians upon the land which we meet today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. I think it's fair to say that First Nations and clean energy probably hasn't had the priority it should have to date in thinking about how we manage that through energy transition, and looking forward to the panel that comes later today. Thanks to the Minister for a very interesting presentation and a very busy agenda on both demand and supply side, and the important role that research can play. Now, in the plenary session this morning, you're going to hear from a couple of big picture, thought-provoking presentations from Drew Clark and Gabrielle Kuiper. I can see Drew, I can't see Gabrielle in the room. Oh, there you are. Sorry. If you'd both like to come up, I'll do a quick introduction and we'll get into it. So the format this morning is going to be two 20-minute presentations, and then we've got a relatively, the best part of 20 minutes for questions and discussion. I hope there's a QR code. There is. Excellent. So it's a great opportunity, I think, to ask questions. So please enter a few in the QR code, and then we'll give people an opportunity to come up and speak, and I'll ask a few questions as well. So to start off with then, I'll introduce Drew first, and then when he's finished, we'll introduce Gabrielle, though I don't think they need a lot of introduction. First presentation by Drew Clark will be on energy transition research priorities, drawing on the SoERC report on Australian electricity transitions, 1900 to 2050, long sweep of history I'm going to cover there, and the ACOLA program to develop a dynamic energy transition research plan. Amongst many things, Drew is a fellow of the Australian Academy of Technology, Science and Engineering, and was awarded an Order of Australia in 2016 for services to public administration. He chairs the Energy Transition Research Committee of the Australian Council of Learned Academies and is the chair of IEMO, but today is speaking purely in capacity as chair of ACOLA. So I'll like Drew to come up, and I'll introduce Gabrielle when second stage. So.
Okay, well, thank you, Chris, and it's actually a hard act to follow, the Assistant Minister, Senator McAllister. The summary of my presentation is I agree, and here's some data to support it. So I'll now dive into that data. But thank you to Erica for the opportunity to speak to you again about the work that ACOLA is doing in this area. So, as Chris has said, I want to talk about energy transition research priorities from the ACOLA perspective, and then I also want to back that in with the perspective from a recent SoERC report. ACOLA, of course, is the council of the 5 learned academies in Australia, and our Energy Research Plan Committee comprises fellows from each of the 5 academies. Ken Baldwin, who's well known to everyone in this room, is one of those, along with Fran Baum, Bruce Godfrey, Sue Richardson, Libby Robin, and we're ably supported by ACOLA staff, and we're financially supported by CSIRO, ARENA and NERA. So our work over the last 2 years has reached a critical point, where we've now published these 6 reports, and I'll just quickly talk you through the scope of them. Our initial report, of course, was the research plan, in which we identified 27 research priorities to support the Australian energy transition. We've since followed that up with an analysis of the funding of Australian energy research, and made some recommendations in that area. We've done 3 synthesis reports reviewing the literature around research priorities in system dynamics, engagement dynamics, and transition dynamics. And one of the authors of one of those reports is in the room. And late last year, we've published a review and recommendations on energy research translation. We think we've laid a solid groundwork for what a cohesive, comprehensive energy transition research plan might look like. Our objective, of course, is to influence what research is done in this area in Australia, to influence the scale of that work, the focus of that work, and the impact of that work to support a successful Australian energy transition. Our next step in this year, in 23, is to move this foundation that we've done through ACOLA with modest funding into a more stable administrative institutional framework to enable these priorities to be reviewed, updated, and perhaps for this work to have greater impact on the research community, funders, doers, and users of research. I'll give you a sense, though, of the key themes that have come out of this work to date, and there are four that I want to highlight. First, around the broad nature of our research effort. It's not as coherent as it should be. The urgency and focus is not targeted clearly on the most critical issues. Critical issues are being researched, but the alignment between criticality and research effort is not as strong as it should be. It's really not consistent, the research effort, with the scale, the risks and the opportunities of the transition. Now, the current policy alignment in the last year is an enormous step forward to achieving this, and Senator McAllister's remarks give me a lot of hope that this is going to change. But right now, it's not as good as it should be. The second key theme out of this ACOLA work is that the social aspects of the transition need much greater research attention. This is the people wellbeing perspective. I've been struck in yesterday's sessions, and I can see in the program today, a much greater emphasis on this work, whether that reflects that more is being done or just the way the conference has evolved. But that's been really pleasing. And I think Lynn Gallagher yesterday in the opening plenary really nailed the case for why this is so important. And there were several presentations yesterday, and the plenary that follows this is going to go even deeper on that. So that's very welcome. But again, as Senator McAllister said, it doesn't work without people, and the research effort is not as strong as it needs to be in that area, in our opinion. Third, research funding. Australia's spending on public sector R&D in the energy transition is comparatively low. We know this from looking at the International Energy Agency analysis, but the IEA methodology in making this comparison is frankly deeply flawed and is comparing apples with oranges with bananas across it. So it's a fact that the IEA reports that we're comparatively low. I'm not sure that the data really does support that when you dig into it. The IEA has been collecting data on publicly funded energy R&D in OECD countries for many years, and Australia duly submits its data in accordance with the IEA methodology. And as I said, it shows declining, and it ranks us 22 out of 30 on a GDP adjusted basis. But some of the flaws in the methodology, it doesn't include policy studies, it doesn't include tax measures. Now, a lot of Australian R&D is supported through the taxation system. It's just not counted in the data. It's necessarily backward-looking. It's always a lagging indicator, and that's quite important. The definition of publicly funded varies from country to country. If your energy sector is, in fact, the public sector, you have an inflated-looking R&D spend. And of course, in many countries, expenditure on nuclear R&D is a very large financial effort. That's zip in Australia, and that, I think, can distort it as well. But the takeout, really, is that we need better data on Australian energy transition research and development. innovation, if you like. And we're arguing that the Australian government should do this in its own right and not be hostage to the flawed IEA methodology. It should measure what we're actually doing and have a forward-looking component as well, and then send to the IEA whatever they ask. So we're pressing this point domestically and indeed in Paris with the IEA. And the fourth key finding is around research translation, and we think there's room for improvement there. There's no point in having a focused and well-funded research program if it has no impact. And this is much more than just commercialisation, although that's certainly part of it. There are some useful institutional models where this has been done. The IPCC's synthesis reports and summary for policymakers, I think, are a really good illustration of research being developed in a way, or being presented in an impactful way. And we look at it in our report at models in Germany and the UK, which have got national coordination of R&D at a more sophisticated level than we've achieved yet in Australia. We make recommendations around research translation, the need for perhaps a research platform to strengthen connections between funders, doers and users of research. We obviously suggest that funding should be better aligned with priorities and that translation should be incentivised in the way funding is provided. Researchers including translation or impact measures and plans within their research design, and access by users to accessible summaries of energy transition research. So I commend those 6 reports to you. They're all obviously on the ACOLA website. I want to turn to a recent SoERC report, Australian electricity transitions over the 120 years to date, and in particular the next 30 years. So this is a report that SoERC colleague Paul Graham and I published just a few weeks ago. What we've attempted to do here is to really look at that history of electricity in Australia and draw lessons from the last 120 years for the next 20 to 30 years. We characterise 4 transitions, both quantitatively and qualitatively, in this report. The 4 transitions: early electrification from 1900 to 1950, characterised by both public and private sector initiatives to electrify our cities, the early stages. And this was classically done globally, of course. The state development period from 1950 to 2000, characterised by a major expansion of our electricity systems and use, dominated by state electricity commissions and culminating in the formation of the national electricity market and the wholesale electricity market in Western Australia. And then 20 years, 2000 to 2020, which we're calling politely the market disruption period or transition, characterised by ongoing market reform, demand stagnation, new technologies entering the system, and of course climate policy and all of its ramifications impacting on electricity in Australia. And we're calling the 2020 to 2050 period decarbonisation, in which of course the imperative is to get to a net zero emission electricity system as soon as possible. The decarbonisation transition is unusual in that it's driven by an external imperative with a quite clear policy objective and time frame. That's not the case in the others. The selection of the dates for the others is somewhat arbitrary, but there are tipping points that can be seen that we outline in the report that justify where we chose to draw those lines. The graph that I'm showing now shows the trajectory of the various fuels for electricity generation in Australia over those periods, but equally interesting in the report is the way the roles of governments and the role of industry and the role of markets have changed over through these transitions. From this work, we've identified 5 requirements that we think are critical for the decarbonisation transition to be successful, and I'll come back to those in a moment. Let's talk a little bit about the decarbonisation transition, and here the accompanying graph is simply the summing of the individual fuels that I showed earlier. But let's look at this decarbonisation transition that we're currently at the early stages of. We've used the AEMO's Integrated System Plan and the WA Whole of System Plan net zero emission scenarios to summarise this decarbonisation transition. The important point is that's a scenario. Before that's a fact, where we've trawled through the data back to 1900. And my colleague Paul has done a terrific job of that. This data set is publicly accessible through the SoERC website, and we would encourage others interested in looking at transitions to exploit this data and do more work on it. Now, the orthodox view of the decarbonisation transition has got, here's a list of the key elements of it. We're going to have coal closure well before the end of life of that plant. We're going to have continuing distributed energy resource growth, generation and storage. We're going to have massive investment in grid-scale wind and solar. We're going to have massive long and medium duration storage, pumped hydro and batteries. We'll have some continuing use of gas for firming. We'll have a massive expansion of transmission and interconnection to support all this. We'll have ongoing market reforms around demand side, flexibility, capacity, and so on. We'll electrify manufacturing, heavy industries and transport. We'll produce hydrogen and use that where electrification is not possible or ineffective, and we'll export hydrogen. And when you add all of that up, you double the size of the electricity system in production and consumption, and it has very different characteristics around flexibility and demand side participation than the legacy system that we're replacing. Now, we know all that. Almost every presentation in these 2 days recites some variation and talks about that. The key point I'm making is that for the next period, the scale, speed and scope of every one of those elements is highly uncertain. It's a scenario. It barely qualifies as a forecast. It's a scenario, and it's based on a range of assumptions, and those assumptions are welcomely incontestable. So we all know about orthodox forecasts. It'll be fascinating to look back in 2050 as to what that curve actually looks like and what the components look like. How big will the hydrogen export sector be? How much demand-side participation will there be? How will we firm all of that grid, wind and solar? What will be the future of distributed generation in our cities and urban areas? Bits of all of that will be there, but the actual mix can't be clear. So, 5 requirements for this to be successful. I have to define success. And, you know, in a statutory sense, success is defined by the National Electricity Objective, but it's much more than that. The price, reliability and security currently in the objective, soon to be augmented by an emissions requirement. Great, that's a foundation, that's clear. But I'll define success at a higher level. Environmentally, a sustainable net zero emission electricity sector that is robust and resilient, not fragile and the subject of frequent scare headlines. Socially, impacted communities, local, regional, Indigenous, vulnerable, disrupted, lots of definitions of communities, impacted communities, plural, are genuinely, deeply engaged in this transition and are overwhelmingly supportive of it. As the Assistant Minister said, we're not going to get 100% support. Overwhelming support is where we should be aiming and should be expecting. Economically, we want to return Australia's comparative advantage in electricity pricing, except that it'll be green electricity pricing. And the benefits to that economically, socially are manifest, and we need to recapture that comparative advantage, which we did enjoy pre the understanding of climate change. So, 5 requirements. This is an unremarkable list, but I hope the report illustrates dimensions of it that perhaps haven't had as much attention as they might. The basket of technologies that we need for a successful transition, most of them are here today. Not all of them have reached anywhere near their peak efficiency or economics. But there is more than just, yes, we need cheaper electrolysers and ways to make hydrogen, and yes, improved solar efficiency is welcome. There's a lot of work around critical systems and capabilities. And AEMO's work in saying, how can we operate the NEM on that fantastic day when we have the first moment of instantaneous 100% inverter-based renewable electricity generation, that 5 minutes, we can't do that today. If the resources were available to do it, we would intervene and stop it, because we can't be sure that the system will stay up. There's a basket of work defined in AEMO's engineering framework that will let us do that, and our aim is to be able to do that within the next 1 to 2 years. That's a key milestone. So there is still a lot of work in the technologies space to be done. Market reform. This new electricity system that we're entering into is a fundamentally different paradigm to the one that the current market was designed to serve, which had good old baseload coal, mid-merit, and small peaking and not much else. There's a lot of work to be done as weather becomes the key fuel, not just the predictor of load. It's still a major predictor of load, but it's now increasingly, of course, and will dominantly be the fuel source. So market reform around flexibility and firming, there's a huge body of work underway, but I think just the beginning stages of that. Infrastructure projects, heard quite a bit about this in several presentations. Our work shows that we need to build generation and transmission at 4 times the rate we've ever done in Australia. And we all know the labour, supply chain, capital costs, etc., constraints on that. That is a huge task to be done. Governance. The governance model of the energy system, of the NEM in particular, reflected the time of its creation around 20 years ago. Why would you imagine that that's exactly the right model for the transition and the path ahead? It is evolving already, and I think the changes that Minister Bowen has made are certainly driving significant reform in the way in which the Commonwealth and the states work together on this task, because after all, states are sovereign in energy policy in Australia, not the Commonwealth. So this move at the moment that is characterised, we've got an old paradigm, and then we have state interventions in order to support the transition. That's a temporary phenomena. The transition is the main game. It shouldn't be the subject of an intervention. It is the core of the process, and the governance models need to reflect that. And finally, community engagement. And I list this last because it's kind of the mother of all of them. It folds across all 4 of those. And we've heard a lot already, and I think we're about to hear a lot more about new approaches to obtaining and retaining the social licence for the energy transition. Now, I emphasise again, the communities that I'm talking about that provide social licence vary from fossil-intensive regions heavily impacted to low-income renting households to, there's all sorts of geographies and structures of this matter, of communities. It's the community as a whole. It's the ability of governments to sustain the focus on energy transition that we have to support as well. So these 5 requirements are highly interdependent. Changes in one impact several, if not all, of the others, and they're highly dynamic. And so the scope of them and the policy response and the research response and the industry response will change during the course of the transition. The key risks that Paul and I see today are 2. These key risks might well change, but right now, the loss of community-wide social licence due to unacceptably high electricity prices, and we've had a taste of what that might look like in recent times, or a crisis in reliability. It's nothing like a blackout to change the community view about energy transition. And the second, significant delays in construction of new infrastructure, generation and transmission, due either to local specific social licence issues or to the global supply chain issues. So they're risks that I think should be front of mind today. And of course, research can play a big role in addressing this. Focused, funded and well-translated research has a critical role in helping policymakers and industry address those 5 requirements and their associated risks and opportunities. Thank you.
Thanks, Drew. That's a fascinating sweep of history and the uncertainty of the future that lies before us. Gabrielle's now going to pick up, I guess, on the theme of the uncertainty and how we need to be thinking about some of the different scenarios that lay out in front of us. Gabrielle is a DER specialist and senior advisor to the Smart Energy Council, previously the DER strategy specialist with the Energy Security Board, and held senior executive or advisory positions in the Office of the Prime Minister, the Public Interest Advocacy Centre and the New South Wales Government. Gabrielle's presentation is going to explore the implications of a future world of DER saturation, the consequences of maximum likely levels of uptake of DER and the public and regulatory actions to optimise the benefits. Take it away.
Thanks very much, Chris. I'd like to also acknowledge that we're here on Gadigal land and pay my respects to elders past and present, any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people here today, and also acknowledge the historical and present inequity of our First Nations peoples. And I'd like to parrot Chris Bowen, the Energy Minister, who said at a conference late last year, there is no form of inequity that climate change does not make worse. So with that, it's a delight to be here, and thanks very much to the ERICA Conference Committee for the opportunity to speak to you. Despite the fact that we have more rooftop solar per capita than any other nation on Earth, and we're now seeing half of our instantaneous renewable energy peaks being distributed PV, and despite some leading research and practice about how to integrate distributed energy resources into the grid, including by people in this room, we're still, in my view, failing to take the implications of distributed energy resources seriously enough to see the potential for lower cost and faster decarbonisation by better harnessing these resources. Now, so far, so familiar to anyone who has heard me talk about DER over the last 5 years. This will all be familiar. But you might say, Gabriel, what really are the implications of DER? And I wondered this myself. How could we look at what happens when you get saturation DER? By which I mean, what happens when every household that could have solar on the roof has solar on the roof? When batteries are near ubiquitous in those households, when we have electric vehicles, when we are making the most of controlled load through a whole variety of smart technologies, what would that look like, and how could one look at that? So I called the smart people at ITP Renewables, and they came up with a way of modelling my thought experiment. So while the initial idea was mine, they did all the hard work that you're about to see. Their approach was to come up with a theoretical suburb, add in maximum PV households, so saying 2/3, 70% of households will have PV at some point in the future. That's inevitable. They're going to have batteries, majority of them, we're going to make the most of those controlled loads. We're also going to have electric vehicles. I'll come to this, but the EVs were only modelled as load, not as vehicle to grid. But we also added in commercial loads and neighbourhood batteries and so on. And this was in a sequential style of modelling. Now, there was no date put towards this, and it was using solar analytics data. Thank you very much to Solar Analytics. And the idea was to put together this theoretical suburb and look at the system level impacts. So people might start thinking about what might those system level impacts be. The first and logical but quite dramatic conclusion is that saturation DER lops the head off the duck. So everyone is familiar with the duck curve in red on the far left. It's like a big duck. If you put in batteries, you get a smaller duck perhaps. Third one, basically sleeping swan perhaps. There is the 4 to 8 p.m. peak that we're all familiar with, basically the pot of gold at the end of the day for anyone who's a gentailer disappears. Before I go on, I'll explain the difference between the can't trade and the can trade. So what we did when setting up this theoretical suburb was create a condition basically with frictionless trading for behind-the-meter batteries. So this could play out in a number of different ways. You could have local use of system charges being zero. You could have net local use of system charges being zero. So you might have networks charging for exports at some time, but also paying people to export from their DER at other times. There's a variety of ways in which you could put this in place, but basically we wanted to make a condition whereby everyone's behind-the-meter resources were available to other people in the neighbourhood that didn't have their own DER. So that's the difference in all of these scenarios when I talk about batteries can trade, essentially frictionless trading. And so that was the graphs. These are the raw numbers, and you can see the basic scenarios range from 2/3 to basically all 92% of the peak disappears. Unfortunately, in the work that we did, we weren't able to go into the financial implications. I'm really hoping that putting this research out there will spawn another dozen research projects that can look at this in different ways and in more detail. I would love someone to model what are the financial implications for our 3 or 4 largest gentailers of having no afternoon, evening peak. Bruce Mountain, some of you would have seen, gave a presentation yesterday talking about some of the dynamics of our neoliberal developed wholesale market and the way in which networks have played out. If you think about the wholesale market was set up to maximise being able to manage the peaks with resources across the NEM, what happens when there aren't these significant peaks every evening. Now, obviously, there'll be seasonal changes. There's a whole lot of investigation. I don't want to downplay, there are never going to be any peaks in future with DER, but I think it's important to think about the consequences of having this massive solar abundance. So that's sort of some of the whole, and obviously also the consequences in terms of hopefully lower costs for all consumers as a result, with a whole lot of provisos if you have to make the trading frictionless and the like. So that's the wholesale market consequences. The second consequence I want to talk about was the flow on to network demand. So not surprisingly, we're already seeing, particularly in states like New South Wales, which have abundant solar during the year, that our summer network peaks with large amounts of PV will become winter network peaks. The changes obviously to network peaks will very much depend on location, not only the level of solar irradiance, but also the level of PV available and how it all flows through. There's all these ifs, buts, but you can see here the really significant changes that you're likely to get in terms of reductions in those peaks. Behind the meter batteries with local trading, you decreasing the average summer network peak in this scenario by 64%. And again, all of our building of networks to cater for the peak, there are consequences there. So that's an opportunity in terms of reducing the network peaks. However, we've also got a big challenge that we won't get rid of the belly of the duck, while we might chop its head off. The belly might not raise up unless we have what I like to call a camel of demand during the middle of the day to match the belly of the duck peak, belly of the duck low. So this is obviously where shifting controlled loads could make a huge difference. And obviously also, what are we going to do with abundant solar in the day? Well, maybe we should electrify transport, and then if you can charge that in the middle of the day, then you get a huge ability to match the abundant solar with the demand. Lots of challenges around that, particularly for fleets that have to have vehicles available continuously, but these are the kind of opportunities I think that looking at DER and having a focus on it really brings out. So good news, I don't know if there's anyone in the room from a DNSP, but one of the real questions I had in my mind thinking about this scenario work was, to what extent will you get high degrees of self-sufficiency within distribution networks and reduce the reliance on the broader grid? Now, you do get increased self-sufficiency in this modelling below the zone substation level. Obviously, that's how we've kind of set it up, especially with the trading of the behind-the-meter batteries. But the good news for DNSPs is they will still have a vitally important role, and particularly in areas where there's lower solar irradiance in winter, you'll need more imports from the grid. So places like Victoria, the offshore wind is obviously going to be particularly important in winter. Different story in Queensland, where you've got good solar resource all the year round. I also think this is also a very good news story. There will still obviously be situations where we'll have a death spiral in remote and regional areas, and that's appropriate. But we want the grid to remain a common resource, and we want people with their privately bought and paid for, albeit subsidised, behind-the-meter resources being able to feed back into the grid as a common resource. Without that, decarbonisation will be slower and more expensive. So I think this is good news, not only for the employees and owners of DNSPs. Of course, it needs further investigation. Another thing I would love would be for someone to commission this research to be done NEM-wide, so you could have a better understanding of how this plays out in different locations, different climate zones and the like. So some major implications through looking at this modelling, but of course I'm going to talk about the policy and planning implications. And I am also very excited about hot water, and I'm particularly delighted that David Roach and the team at ISF and Race for 2030 have started to look at this, because it is obviously a really significant opportunity to go from gas to smart electric and then to being able to have demand responsive programs. Yesterday it was mentioned Ohm Connect have come to Australia. They're actually behind Origin's Spike product, and Origin are planning to have 4 gigawatt VPP by 2026, if I remember correctly, and within 4 years. And so Origin is certainly one company that is seeing the potential to really harness DER and flexible demand. The other thing that I would add on hot water that I think is a really interesting area for research, may already been looked at, not sure, is if we think about every hot water system in Victoria and almost all of them in South Australia and quite a lot in New South Wales are going to have to be electrified, preferably as soon as possible, preferably by 2030. How are we going to get enough smart electric heat pumps into the system at affordable cost, and what might that mean in terms of local manufacturing and scaling that up here? I think, the manufacturing question needn't be ideological about we always have to make it here, but when you're looking at scaling up and when you're looking at places like the US and Europe scaling up manufacturing for their own purposes, we need to be aware that we can't simply import this, and we need to look at how to do that really quickly here. So EV charging, obviously a huge challenge within a DER-focused future. Neil Horrocks from UQ yesterday talked about the importance of network visibility and doing that, getting that data, and I think this is an area where it would be wonderful to have the DNSPs having greater visibility and sharing that publicly, because the crucial thing strikes me about EV charging is making sure it's put in the right places, maybe that's with neighbourhood batteries, and ensuring that we can make the most of the local abundant solar in the grid to use for EV charging. That's not going to be universally the case, but there's a real challenge, I think, to get this right. I don't think anyone is looking at it sufficiently enough. Like, there are DNSPs who are doing some interesting rollouts of EV charging and the like, but they're not necessarily, without disparaging anyone, looking at it at the lowest cost or making the most of the abundant solar for the EV charging. And then the EV charging company's interest is not in making the most of abundant solar during the day and the like. So I think there's an interesting question for people in the room on that one. Likewise with neighbourhood batteries, as I've always mentioned. Someone mentioned the evil words of tariff reform earlier. Been waiting a long time for tariff reform, so and I think it's potentially needed for neighbourhood batteries to work as effectively for the common good as possible. But I know Dr. Marnie Shaw and other people in the room are working on this, and I think there's a lot more to be done there, and this saturation DER modelling work shows how important that is if we are going to have neighbourhood batteries. And then there's the question about how is DER trading going to best work. I think this is an area where we have actually started to do some interesting research and sort of pilot projects. People in the room be familiar with Project Edge and Symphony, which have a trading platform. And then there's Project Edith, which, if you're not familiar with it, is an intriguing model where it's just real-time network pricing, no platform, but a way to potentially pay people for the use of their behind-the-meter DER technology to use for network support services. And I think it's great that we've got these models now, and very keen to see the results of those and to have that flow through to help maximise the best use of all the behind-the-meter resources. And not just because Drew's on the platform, but not surprisingly, I think the ISP really needs to have scenarios for DER in the same variety and variation that it does for large-scale resources. I think it's understandable that all of our planning and policy has come from the historical background of really focusing on the large-scale resources, but I'd say that all of the energy market institutions need to learn to sweat the small stuff, and hopefully I've convinced you all here that's because it has really significant impacts. So that's that one. So those are sort of the implications from the DER saturation modelling. But I, of course, have an extra list of other policy and regulatory changes on DER I'd like to see, which partly go through. The first one I've talked about. I just discovered a DER division in the Commonwealth Department, so that's covered off, which is fantastic. The other piece in terms of, I've talked about hot water, but really we have no means at the moment of ensuring that all the large household appliances have any sort of communication, let alone ability to be controlled. So I've previously recommended that that could be done through the GEMS Act, would require legislative change, open to ideas about how else you might do it, and particularly get that done faster and more effectively, because there is, air conditioning going into people's homes every day, and those are, at the moment, unfortunately, just going to be dumb appliances. When you can see from all the graphs, we're going to need to make sure that we can make the most of all the flexible demand resources available into the future. So it would also help if the demand response mechanism had included aggregated household demand. Hopefully now the wholesale demand response mechanism is up and running. We can say, well, let's now consider aggregated household demand. Origin are doing that without that incentive. Maybe other retailers will step up, but I do think that making that regulatory change provides a reliable income stream that innovators could use to make the most of this DER aggregation. Vehicle to grid, a bit of a, I guess, I see that as a kind of holy grail, and I might be over-optimistic about it, but obviously vehicle batteries in EVs being 6 to 10 times larger than your average Powerwall, those are going to be enormous resources. I think electric vehicles are very expensive decarbonisation of transport, but if you can use them as batteries on wheels, then that will be really significant for decarbonisation. I don't think we should decarbonise the entire fleet. I think we should maybe decarbonise half the fleet and then move the other trips to walking, cycling and public transport. But the half that we do decarbonise, we really need to make the use of those as batteries on wheels. And seeing I've got time, I'm going to tell my favourite story, stolen from Newcastle City Council, who, as some of you will know, have put a solar farm at their waste transfer facility. They're now buying electric garbage trucks. Those electric garbage trucks will drive and deposit the garbage and be able to power up at the solar farm. That's nice. But what's more is the council, being in the Hunter, has already realised and worked out ways they can use those garbage trucks as emergency power supply in the case of fires or floods. So they will be sending out a fleet of garbage trucks to be able to power local community halls and emergency facilities should the need arise, which I think goes to another point I wanted to be sure to make today, is that the other aspect of DR is the resilience that it provides. You know, we know the challenges that happened in South Australia wasn't the wind turbines' faults. You know, it was the fact that the transmission wasn't built to cope with climate change and the large winds that resulted. But we also know that DER can continue to provide supply when, for example, transmission is cut off. There were stories during the bushfires of people putting power cables across the road from their batteries and solar systems to other people's fridges to keep their food able to be maintained through the bushfires when that happened. And I think while resilience isn't in the NEO or in any of our planning documents, given the pace of climate change, that's a really important consideration. It'd be really nice to have an independent technical standards authority, because I think we need to get the DER technical standards in and updated quickly, and forward plan for that. And then finally, obviously I started with inequity, and we do need to improve the thermal comfort of low-income housing where that is cost-effective to do so, and electrify, get rid of those unhealthy polluting gas appliances, and put the solar on the roofs, and that's an important role for government. But I wanted to finish on the point about where this whole idea came from, which is, we all know forecasting is always wrong. This modelling will also be wrong. The point about backcasting is that the end point here is likely. At some point we will have saturation levels of PV and batteries and EVs and the like. The date we get there, that's unknown. I first learned about backcasting when I was a young PhD student at the new Institute for Sustainable Futures. So I wasn't quite sure how best to summarise the full circle lesson in that, other than I think we need lots of different ways to look creatively at the future in order to be the best prepared for it. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I'm looking forward to seeing a wave of research on sleeping swans, camels and duck bellies coming out of this presentation. So now we have a period for questions. I might start one or two questions off, but if people want to put their hands up and come up to the microphone. I can see an orderly line forming already from the front there. So I'll throw a question, and then maybe we'll go to Ken and then Roger and Ariel. Great to see we've got people lining up. So first question, I guess, we've both presented a really ambitious agenda there for research. Drew, I thought maybe you might want to start by talking about what the next steps are for the ACOLA model and project for bringing some coherence.
Thanks. Thanks, Chris. So, as I mentioned, the 6 reports we've published are the sort of the foundation, first stage of the work. We've poured the foundations. We now need to build a house. And one of the conclusions that we've reached is that the work needs to be supported by an enduring institution that is well set up to do an ongoing program and to talk about it and engage with it and with all of the stakeholders. And that's not what ACOLA is set up to do. So we're talking to one of our funding partners, CSIRO, about whether or not they would take on the task of turning this into an ongoing piece of work. The scope would be that we're discussing would be every, say, 2 years. What's the state of the energy transition? How's it going? And what does that tell us about research priorities, updating the research priorities? We're early stage of that discussion, and there'll certainly be consultation with the research community before any decisions are made about the shape of that. But that's the pathway we're taking for this calendar year.
Great. Look forward to hearing more about that. Maybe there's quite a line of questions. I might get started on the questions. We've got some more, but start with Ken, Roger and Ariel, I think.
Great, thanks very much. Good segue, actually, for this question. So, Drew, we see a community of people here. There's a lot of feedback. We reduce the volume? Thanks. We see a great community of people here already willing and able to put their shoulders to the wheel. But what we don't have is an imperative and driver from government. You mentioned going to CSIRO. I think this is a great step forward to take on the ongoing role in the Australian Energy Transition Research Plan. Let me give you a counter example. So next week in Canberra, I'm chairing the Australian Hydrogen Research Conference. That is being bankrolled by government. There is government money to support an ongoing conference series in hydrogen research because the government thinks this is important. Why doesn't the government think that the energy transition is important? Why isn't there the same sort of backing and money for the Australian Energy Transition Research Plan coming from government that will enable researchers like us to put our shoulders to the wheel and make this thing happen? I think this is the missing element here, and I think that this community, with your backing and support, needs to really come together and say to government that research is going to make this transition happen faster, cheaper and more effectively than it would without it, and they need to get behind it. So I'd like your views on that.
Sure. So you want me to explain government? Is that the question, Ken? Yeah, no risk there. Look, after 40 years working in government, where do I start? Policy is a long game, and this would be a policy shift. And I mentioned, as you know, that I think there are some analogues for where other countries have developed more coherent government-led and supported energy transition research programs, and we call out in the Ecola paper on this UK and Germany. I don't think it's a coincidence that UK and Germany have had a political consensus about addressing climate change for a lot longer than Australia has. So I think the political alignment around the policy imperative is perhaps a precondition for getting to the sort of framework that we've talked about. We've now satisfied that precondition. We hope it endures. Can't be certain of that yet, but we've at least got it now. Yes, that's the key theme. That's finding number one of the Ecola work. It's not coherent, focused or funded in a way that is commensurate with the task and its risks and opportunities. So yes, engagement with government is critical.
A quick follow-up on that. This conference is a great opportunity for government to actually see what's going on and to hear some of the forward-looking over-the-horizon research that will inform the transition. One of the things that I'm doing next week at the Hydrogen Research Conference is to have discussion panels from industry, from government, and then one chaired by the chief scientist at the end to ask the community what they think are the key research questions going forward. That will inform industry and government activity in the area. So could this conference take on a similar role on the energy transition and show the value of government support for the energy transition plan going forward?
Well, it could if Erica wanted it to, yes. And that's a matter for Erica. And as you know, we've had, and Ariel knows, we've had that discussion several times over the last few years. So yes, it has that potential. The other dimension that I think is very important is, you know, I think of this from a public policy perspective. That's my background. And how does the research community influence public policy? And as I mentioned in my presentation, I think the most helpful illustration of that is how the climate science community has influenced public policy through the IPCC work, ultimately the synthesis reports and the summaries for policymakers. And I think, 25 research papers on social licence is terrific, but what policymakers want is one synthesis report that draws out the policy lessons from those 25 studies and presents it in a digestible way. And and I've chosen that example at random. It applies across the whole transition spectrum. So there's lots of different ways that we can influence government from this research community. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Roger.
Thanks, Chris. Gabrielle, Roger Dargaville from Monash University. In your talk, you talked about getting EVs charged during the day instead of what's probably the accepted wisdom at the moment, that they'll be more likely charged at night time at homes. If you're going to charge the cars during the day, they're going to be not parked at homes, but where the owners are during the day doing their work, study, shopping, etc. So have you thought much about what the infrastructure would look like in terms of EV chargers in public garages, railway stations, schools, universities, etc.?
Not in any detail other than sort of what you've mentioned, but I think that's to my point that we need a lot more research on that and to do some scenarios. And, I don't think it sounds far-fetched at all to say that people will drive to work or the shopping centre and the like. And we're already seeing shopping centres putting massive solar arrays. They understand that if they offer free EV charging, then that's an incentive for their customers. And we can obviously do fleet charging as is being done now by storing the solar in the batteries, and then the fleet cars will be charged overnight. But why would you introduce that redundancy into the system if you don't have to? So I just think we have to get smarter about it. And I think the incentives, economic incentives, are aligned to do so.
Ariel?
Thanks, Chris. And Ariel Liebman, Monash Energy Institute, Monash University. And thanks for those possibly two of the handful of most important talks at the conference, I think. And so I've got a question to Drew and Gabrielle. Maybe I'll take the prerogative to ask a question just to Gabrielle as well. And I think I can double them up. So Australia is at the bleeding edge, in fact, of the energy transition of the world. In fact, we probably, and I'm not sure if you've got those numbers, but I've found it hard to get, is that as a continental scale grid, we've got the most wind and solar by energy of any continental scale grid in the world, and yet we're the skinniest grid in the world. So how to manage this, and we're rushing towards 80% renewables, barring all those issues that you've talked about might slow it down, faster than anybody else in the world. We can't buy the know-how on how to operate the system from the EU or US or their engineers or whoever. There's just nobody's ever done this before. We have to invent this here. And we probably have less than 5 years to get it slam dunk sorted. And so this is for the research community. How do we get government to take this seriously? I just think that somebody's got their head in the sand up there. So somehow it's all going to get sorted out. Maybe we can do some emergency backstop mechanism type stuff. And this is where it goes to where Gabrielle's interest is. If we do get some serious way towards this 100% sort of full DR saturation, then this is partly the cause of the challenge. So how do we handle this? And the secondary question then for Gabrielle is, the elephant in the room for the DNSPs is, if the vision you see is going to materialise, which I think it will eventually, by definition, this degrades the value of DNSP's asset bases. So why on earth would they actually cooperate with in making this happen? Thank you.
Well, Ariel, I don't accept fully the premise of your question, in that this is not a government issue. This is not, and you say, why isn't government do something about it? No. This is actually AEMO's core business, and we're extremely focused on it. And the as I mentioned briefly, we're rapidly approaching the situation where the resources, the wind and solar resources, and it'll be in the middle of the day inevitably, are available to power the NEM and the WEM. And people haven't talked a lot about West Australia. West Australia is a fantastic illustration of many of these things, and it's got particular challenges of its own. But we're at the point where the NEM and the WEM will have the solar and the wind resources to support the entire grid. Right? Well, AEMO has to allow that to happen, not be forced to intervene for energy security reasons, and allow that to happen. And the engineering framework, published last year, available on the AEMO website, spells out exactly what we're doing to enable that to happen. So this is not a government issue, this is an operator issue, and it's a lot of engineering, systems, capabilities issues. But as I hope I illustrated in my report, that's getting to that first moment. 5 minutes of doing that is a massive milestone. But we'll want to get to the point where it's 5 hours and then it's 5 days and so on. And there's a lot of other work that's needed in it, including in the market reform area. But I don't lay that one at government at all. That's right now engineers, power system engineers, all of you that run power system engineering courses, more strength to your arm. That's the need.
I probably didn't close the loop on my statement properly. Why isn't government taking seriously enough to find research to support AEMO in the fact that we cannot invent this in industry alone?
Well, but AEMO's not assuming we're going to import this. We're doing it. We're doing it.
To follow up on that point, I was absolutely delighted in Daniel Westerman's first speech as CEO of AEMO. His announcement was AEMO will be able to manage 100% instantaneous renewables by 2025. So that, I think, is fantastic, and there's obviously the engineering framework and all the pieces of work that are being done to make that possible. What I sometimes find frustrating, particularly on the DER side, and I've given talks internationally to people who are very concerned about what happens when you get like 10 or 20% of houses with solar and the whole grid is going to fall over. We've had a whole historical legacy in Australia of technical scaremongering about DER, and so disproportionate to the facts. So the Assistant Minister was talking about misinformation and counteracting that. And some people in the room know that when I was at the Energy Security Board, there was all the scaremongering about voltage, and solar's causing all these voltage issues on the grid. And so commissioned some research from University of New South Wales, I think Ian McGill's not in the room, but with Rob Passy and some very smart people there. And that research showed there were pre-existing high voltage issues in the distribution networks across the country, which had nothing to do with rooftop solar. In fact, a lot of those DNSPs were operating outside the voltage guidelines, and the regulators still really haven't acted on that, apart from there's been a little bit of a intervention in Victoria. But those are historic high voltage levels as a legacy of the air conditioning boom in the 90s and the 2000s, nothing to do with rooftop solar. Now, yes, obviously, rooftop solar can raise voltages if you get enough of it in the grid, but if you were operating your DNSPs within the voltage range that it was supposed to be, it shouldn't be an issue. And this really, if you want absolutely crystal clear statement of how much solar can be handled in the grid, South Australian Power Networks, as probably everyone in the room knows, has been at the forefront of putting in place dynamic operating envelopes. And when I first heard about dynamic operating envelopes, fantastic concept, there's a floor and a ceiling, and maybe you hit the peak, maybe half the time you're limiting people's exports. And then they did the modelling as to how how much of the time that you might need to have that dynamic operating envelope limit kick in. And it's basically for a few days a year in spring when you've got very low loads and very high solar generation. So it was, I think, 97% of the time. And this is in a state with over 40% of households with solar on the grid. So, you know, I appreciate engineers are risk managers first and foremost, but I also think that the level of technical scaremongering has been completely disproportionate. Rooftop solar's been blamed for, you know, the way the grids have been managed. And the final point in the question about, well, what does this mean for DNSPs? In fact, I think it makes them more relevant because of the exports as well as the imports. So there's no decline in their value. They're just going to be used in a different way. And the exciting thing, if we can plan it properly, get all the policies, regulations, technical standards in place, we should get that, you know, utopian vision of a multi-way grid with all of these resources being able to use throughout it. So, you know, with the exception of remote and rural places that can go off-grid, the DNSPs should be making the most of all of these resources. And I shouldn't disparage all of the DNSPs. There are DNSPs like Sapin who are seeing that future and looking to make the most of the DER and the grid.
Can I just make a response, because I feel like Gabrielle was suggesting that I'm scaremongering. I don't normally want to do this, but I feel like it sounded like I was scaremongering, and I'm not. I think we need as much rooftop solar as possible, and we just need the systems thinking to look at all the ways these things come together and actually manage these things, and consumer issues are paramount in that. And there's a whole bunch of staging of how do you deploy all these dynamic operating envelopes, you know, in cooperation with consumers. It's not obvious to me that they all know what they're in for if that's going to come in at scale. And then we need storage to limit over voltage. And so I just wanted to point that out. And I'm wanting to be part of the solution collectively, but it's important to identify what the problems are there might be, because we only got one shot at this. If we do get something wrong, there's going to be a lot of political action to try and mitigate any possible disasters. So it's good to get ahead of this, because we only got it's a one-way street now, this transition, and we don't have any do-overs like with climate change.
All right, thank you. I think there's one or two more questions, but we're 10 minutes over already, so I think we better let everyone go and have a morning tea before the next session. But I'd like to thank you both for great presentations, stimulating, I think, a lot of debate. We could keep going for a while, but I'm sure people might take the opportunity of the break to take up the discussion further. Thank you, everyone.